You're watching a 14-year-old girl being dragged from the emperor's chamber. Her sandals scrape the marble, a pale line across a floor polished to a mirror sheen. Perfume hangs in the air like a layer of illusion. Silk flashes. Behind her, men move with the dispassionate efficiency of servants carrying out orders. Her eyes are empty, not because she cannot see, but because the part of her that names herself has been put away. This is one of the images that ancient writers, fragmented, hostile, and often theatrical, leave us when they tell the story of what they call the Garden of Venus. It's also the image at the center of the question that drives this episode. Why, according to later accounts, did girls taken to Caligula's palace sometimes seem to wish for death? Before we go further, the title of this piece uses the phrase Vestal virgins as a charged frame. That choice is rhetorical, not a claim that these girls were members of Rome's Vestal priesthood. Ancient sources do not identify them as Vestals. They describe young women taken into the imperial household from noble families and kept in a space the sources call variously a garden or a nursery tied to the emperor's pleasures. Some later writers and some modern discussions have used the language of sanctity to underscore the scandal, sacred purity violated by imperial power, but that is a metaphor. Where I say Vestal in this narrative, understand it as a literary device pointing to the way these girls were presented, white-clad, ceremonialized, framed as a kind of dedication, and not as an assertion of priestly status. The evidence remains fragmentary. When I rely on particular passages, I will flag them. According to Suetonius, Tacitus records, Cassius Dio writes, fragments suggest, and Galen later comments. These caveats matter because the record is partial and often polemical. If this story grips you, and you want more deep dives into history's hidden cruelties and the ways power institutionalizes them, subscribe. This channel aims to bring fragments and silences into conversation. To understand how a palace came to produce despair, we need to trace a long shadow back to childhood and courtly apprenticeship. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, was born amid adoration. His father, Germanicus, was a popular general. The boy grew up in triumphal parades and was nicknamed for the small boots, the caligae, that made a soldier of him in miniature. That early image of affection is important. A ruler who received worship as a child learns power as entitlement. But adoration in infancy did not inoculate him against trauma. After Germanicus died, the imperial household became a place of suspicion. The reign of Tiberius, who succeeded Augustus and ruled from Capri in a climate of paranoia, produced a culture in which denunciation and purges became instruments of governance. Caligula's adolescence and early manhood were shaped in that cold light.
Tacitus and Suetonius, writing decades later with their own agendas, both emphasize the psychological turn: fever, isolation on Capri, a period of illness after which the young prince returned altered. Whether that fever was literal, or whether it stands in sources as shorthand for a personality changed by years of courtly cruelty, is a question scholars debate. Still, it is a plausible anchor. An upbringing in which cruelty is both performed for advantage and modeled as invisible normality makes a certain pattern of behavior more likely. So how did adoration turn into an organized machine for taking people apart? The Garden of Venus, as the surviving accounts depict it, was less an accidental den of debauchery than a bureaucratic operation. Suetonius, writing with relish for scandal, but also with administrative curiosity, and Cassius Dio, recording a broader political history, give us overlapping images: young girls, often from noble families, selected for proximity to the emperor. The selection criteria were not mystical. Age, appearance, and social rank mattered. Officials kept ledgers. Imagine wax tablets, their faces scratched with lists, names sealed and countersigned. Officers of the palace bureaucracy, men we might think of as clerks in imperial service, were charged with gathering girls for the imperial household and recording them as if they were entries in an inventory. These were administrative routines: quotas, inspections, reports. Tacitus and Suetonius emphasized the procedural feel of it, the way human beings were reduced to checkmarks. This is not to allege a modern genocidal factory. The scale and cultural contexts are different. Yet the metaphor of a factory is useful because it captures the banality of the mechanics at work. Officials understood that names on a tablet could be ordered and produced like goods. That banality is itself violent. The more routinized an atrocity, the less its perpetrators must confront its moral weight. Families, especially those who stood to gain imperial favor, were sometimes complicit. implicit. An offering of a daughter could be framed as a privilege, an honor that brought the house closer to power. Children would be dressed in white, presented as ceremonially dedicated, and a ritual gloss would be placed over the exchange. For some families, the calculation was cold. A daughter in the imperial household could mean influence, protection, and the appearance of piety. For other parents, fear, not pride, moved their hand. Sources are ambiguous here. Tacitus hints at both pride and coercion in aristocratic attitudes. Fragmentary statements suggest that some families resisted, while others acceded with smiles. We must not moralize too quickly. The ancient honor system and the pressures of survival in a precarious political order produced agonizing choices. Inside the palace, the world of velvet and marble was designed to do two things at once, to dazzle and to isolate.
Picture an enclosed garden, hedges clipped into formal patterns, fountains kept in ornamental motion, marble columns ringed with delicate reliefs, perfumed fumes that disguise the smell of long days and sleepless nights. The trappings of luxury, silk, jewelry, garlands, were not simply indulgence. They were a carefully engineered environment meant to dissolve social anchors. Separated from family, under constant surveillance, and surrounded by attendants who both catered to and reported on their movements, the girls were placed in a paradoxical bind. Beauty and abundance masked coercion. The forms of care, private tutors, music lessons, fine linens, were levers of control, a strategy that produced cognitive dissonance. The mind registers both immeasurable privilege and the removal of autonomy. Over time, behavior adapts. Modern psychology gives us phrases to help make sense of the pattern. Learned helplessness, a concept first described in 20th century experiments, captures how repeated inescapable stressors teach a person to stop attempting escape. Cognitive dissonance describes the mental realignment that happens when one must reconcile two incompatible realities, a gilded chamber and the loss of choice. When we apply these terms to history, we must label them as interpretation. They help us understand testimonies that are themselves partial. The sources describe girls who, when later encountered by outsiders or later historians' imaginations, exhibit behaviors we might now read as symptoms of trauma, withdrawal, muteness, fits of trembling, or a resigned acceptance of fate. Galen, the physician writing later, notes physical and psychological symptoms in those who had endured palace life, but his observations are clinical and limited. Fragments suggest that some survivors exhibited ongoing distress, sleep disturbances, inability to trust, and a chronic sense of shame. It follows that a set of conditions designed to undermine agency, luxury as a cage, isolation, monitoring, intermittent rewards and punishments, could produce a profound collapse of hope. The cruelty did not remain private. Caligula weaponized public performance. Consider the Imperial banquet, a stage where senators, their families, and Rome's elite gathered to witness the emperor's magnanimity and power. But Suetonius preserves anecdotes that show how those same banquets could become theaters of humiliation. One notable example involves a senator, Valerius Asiaticus, alluded to in the sources as having been publicly shamed through the manipulation of his personal relationships. Whether the specific stories are apocryphal or accurate, they illuminate a pattern. The emperor's capacity to segregate and return dignity at will produced a dependency that silenced dissent. If a man's public honor, the currency of Roman elite life, could be dissolved in front of peers by an imperial jest or command, the cost of retaliation was not only personal vengeance but social death.
This is where complicity becomes structural. When powerful men saw their wives or daughters used as tokens of favor or as instruments of punishment or reward, many chose silence. Shame operated as a regulator. In a culture where honor governed social capital, admitting that one's family had been compromised was itself a form of ongoing shaming. Families might present a daughter to the palace, and at home reframe the exchange as voluntary, ritualized, or advantageous. Again, the sources vary. Tacitus records outrage and condemnation in some quarters, while Suetonius revels in scandal. These accounts, written after the fact, and often against the backdrop of political change, must be read with caution. But the pattern is clear enough. Public humiliation served as a mechanism of control because it entangled the elite in a web of complicity from which retreat was costly. And yet, systems require rupture to change. The rupture in this case came from inside the palace guard. Cassius Chaerea, named in Cassius Dio and Suetonius, was a praetorian tribune whose personal humiliation fed political assassination. According to Suetonius and Tacitus, Chaerea resented the emperor's mockery and the erosion of military dignity. He had been targeted by what ancient writers describe as insults to his masculinity and honor, jokes about his speech, ridicule that a Roman officer found intolerable. The murder itself, as the sources agree, occurred in a confined space, a narrow corridor near the imperial private apartments. Whether the details of melody and movement can be precisely reconstructed is doubtful, but the broad strokes are well attested. Chaerea and his co-conspirators entered the emperor's apartment, attacked, and when confronted by palace staff, they used the password system, the ritualized signals that opened imperial doors, to move through the complex. The scene is stark, a private instrument of terror confronted by the sudden violence of those it had trained and humiliated. The assassination is not a tidy moral reversal. It is an accident of honor politics. Chaerea did not act because he loved liberty. He acted because his own dignity had been crushed, and because he had access and motive. Ancient sources present this as the climax of a life of imperial caprice. Even that crescendo did not wash clean the system it exposed. After Caligula's death, Claudius assumed the throne. Rather than center the issue, hold public reckoning, preserve the stories of victims, or try the bureaucrats who had kept the ledgers, Claudius moved toward containment. Tacitus and Cassius Dio record that the imperial household's records were purged, and that survivors were quietly dispersed, often with compensation or marriage arrangements used to close scandals. Claudius had political reasons. Stability required the smoothing of outrage, and the empire needed an image of continuity. The cost was erasure. Official papers were destroyed or sequestered.
Testimony was scattered into fragments, rumor, anecdote, and passing references weaving a partial memory. This act of archival violence compounded the harm. When records vanish, survivors are left with fewer means of vindication. History itself, as a social good, becomes an instrument of forgetting. The bodies that returned from the palace, when they returned, carried long shadows. Later commentators, including Galen, the physician, remark on lingering effects. Galen's medical framework is clinical. He notes symptoms consistent with chronic stress, sleeplessness, changes in appetite, weakness. Other later fragments, preserved in moralizing histories or anecdotal collections, suggest that some women never recovered the capacity to speak of their experience, or that they married poorly, or that their lives were shortened by despair. I must be careful here. The source base for specific clinical claims is thin. When I say that survivors prayed for death, I am translating a rhetorical image found in late accounts into modern language about despair. Some ancient writers use hyperbolic phrasing to dramatize the depth of suffering. Others note the quiet withdrawal of survivors as a pattern. The phrase in the title is therefore shorthand for extreme psychological collapse recorded or implied in the sources, not a literal, consistently attested statement. The fragmentary nature of the testimony is itself instructive. What survives is a palimpsest. Later historians rewrote scandal to suit moralizing agendas. Copyists preserved anecdotes that amused or horrified. Official archives that might have contained petitions, ledgers, or correspondence vanished with political transitions. Suetonius, writing with a penchant for anecdote, is sometimes unreliable on details, but valuable for the tone he preserves. Tacitus, whose ambition was to interpret the moral meaning of empire, frames events within a larger narrative about corruption and decay. His judgments are as much rhetorical shaping as factual record. Cassius Dio, working from senatorial memory, supplies formal chronology and detail, but writes centuries after events. These are the voices we have. Their testimony, when read together, gives contour without resolution. We can map systems. We cannot name every victim. That fragility of memory matters because it echoes another pattern, the political use of embarrassment to destroy testimony. Erasure is not simply an administrative act, it is a moral silencing. When documents vanish, so do avenues for justice, for commemoration, and for accountability. Claudius's purge, documented in surviving histories, was a closing of the book. Where officials once kept wax tablets as inventories, those ledgers were turned into rumor, and rumor into silence. In the centuries that followed, the Garden of Venus would survive more as an emblem of imperial depravity than as a well-documented institution.
Literary historians and moralists seized the image and made it a cautionary tale about unchecked power, but cautionary tales can both remember and distort. There is one final, uncomfortable thing to face: the ways in which systems reproduce themselves. The Roman story is ancient, its actors long dead, but the pattern, the routinization of abuse, the conversion of people into ledger entries, the use of public shame to compel private silence, recurs. Modern institutions sometimes learn to manage harm rather than to root it out. Bureaucracies create distance between decision-makers and victims. That distance facilitates choices that would look monstrous in the light of immediate human presence, but feel merely administrative from a ledger. To speak honestly about the Garden of Venus is not to equate Rome with modern states. It is to notice structural similarities and insist that awareness of pattern is a tool of prevention. If we step back from the specific images, marble floors, wax tablets, a narrow corridor, and ask what remains of the people in these stories, the answer is both sorrow and obligation. Sorrow because even the best preserved accounts reduce living pain to fragments. Obligation because telling these stories, with their caveats and uncertainties, is a small act of repair. When sources are partial, historians must do two things at once: assemble what evidence exists and acknowledge what cannot be known. We can describe the mechanisms by which the palace functioned, we can map the social incentives that made it possible, and we can interpret some psychological consequences, but we must resist the seductions of completeness. A brief reconstruction might help us feel the human dimension without claiming to make it factual. Imagine a girl of 14. This is an imagined vignette, a reconstruction, not a citation, brought to a room that looks like a temple of leisure. She is given garments that make her body into an emblem. She is praised for qualities she does not yet control. At first, there is awe. Then routines form. Attendants monitor her letters, limit her movements, and praise or scold her in calibrated doses. Sometimes she is praised, sometimes she is denied human warmth. Over months, she learns that pleading yields nothing, that obedience keeps immediate pain at bay, and that resistance leads to isolation. The psychological architecture of control, intermittent rewards, social surveillance, and the withholding of information erodes hope. This bleak arc is not a single person's fate in every instance, and it is not a literal transcript of any source. It is a plausible reconstruction intended to make the stakes intelligible. The sources, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and later references by Galen, are the scaffolding of our account.
According to Suetonius, Caligula exercised both whim and design. Tacitus frames excess as symptomatic of imperial decay. Cassius Dio provides the political scaffolding, and Galen notes the medical aftereffects in individuals seen later. Fragments suggest further details, but fragments are by definition incomplete. At least 3 times in this narrative I have flagged uncertainty: in the opening about the meaning of Vestal, in the description of Caligula's formative illness and its consequences, and in the discussion of survivors' symptoms. These are not evasions, they are the ethical practice of working with the partial remains of a troubled past. What then does it mean that survivors prayed for death? Read literally in every case, it would be an overstatement. Read as a rhetorical compression, it conveys profound despair, the erosion of agency, and the collapse of future towards which some accounts gesture. That shorthand needs constant qualification because it obscures the varied and messy reality of human resilience and suffering. Some women may have adapted in ways that allowed them to live outwardly normal lives. Others may have been marked in ways that made ordinary existence a continuous, painful negotiation. The sources, at best, give us hints. There is an ethical dimension to the telling. We are not haunted only by Caligula's grotesque reputation. We are haunted by the ways in which institutions make monsters and then erase the evidence. When official memory is curated to protect the state, victims are further isolated. Remembering is a political act. To recover fragments of these lives is to insist on a kind of accountability across the centuries, that institutions and those who serve them be assessed not only by efficiency or grandeur, but by the harms they inflict. This is why studying such episodes matters beyond antiquarian curiosity. The ancient record warns us of how ordinary administrative practices, ledgers, seals, quotas, can be turned toward moral atrocity when combined with social systems that valorize honor and obedience, and with leaders whose impulses go unchecked. The Garden of Venus is a case study in how beauty can be weaponized, how shame can silence, and how archival erasure can become the second violence after the first. If you want to explore this further, the primary voices to consult remain Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and Galen. Their texts, with all their biases and ruptures, are the starting points. Scholarly work since the 19th century has wrestled with these fragments, trying to separate polemic from plausible institution. Read them with attention to tone and skepticism, and remember, missing papers, destroyed ledgers, and the moral convenience of forgetting are themselves historical sources. They tell us something about the priorities of rulers who preferred stability to truth.
In the end, the image that lingers is not of the emperor's excess alone, but of the quiet economies of harm that normalize abuse. The marble will wear on, the wax tablets will melt, names will be scratched out, but the cultural lesson, that certain forms of power and administrative detachment enable human damage, remains.
To speak of the girls taken to the palace as Vestal virgins may be rhetorically striking, but it must always be followed by correction. This label is a metaphor, not a citation. To say that some prayed for death is, in the best sense, shorthand for a condition of hope extinguished by institutional cruelty, a condition that the sources suggest but cannot fully document. If this story moved you, share it with someone who cares about the ways history teaches us to look closer. Leave a comment on what surprised you most, and subscribe so we can keep bringing these fragmented histories back into view. Remembering is small, imperfect work, but it matters.